All right. Well, welcome everybody to the first of our 5-part series on grant writing. I'm Kelsey Bro. I'm the director at King Manor, a historic house museum in Queens, New York, pretty close to JFK Airport. And we are joined by the wonderful Cassandra Cavness.
Hi, everyone. So as Kelsey said, my name is Cassandra. I am the development assistant for the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, located in Montgomery, Alabama.
And we are... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're excited to have you all here tonight with us.
All right. I was going to say the same thing, and also that we are board members of the NEMPN official 501c3 nonprofit that supports emerging museum professionals.
We're the East Coast. Together, we make up the East Coast.
Yep, from
Kelsey
top to
is
bottom.
the Northeast. Yeah, Kelsey is the Northeast, and I have the Southeast. So we have the East all covered.
So any of your EMP needs, feel free to reach out to us or our organization. We have people who represent everywhere in the US, and we are getting more and more people in Canada and elsewhere abroad as well. So we look forward to having you join us for this workshop series as well as many others. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and give the intro to what we're talking about tonight. So just in case you need to step away to refresh your coffee or anything, this is where we're going to be going through. We're going to start with these topics and hope that we'll get some good interaction when we get toward the end. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll see if we can address them as we go. And otherwise there'll be some time for some live Q&A, and we'll also take another look at the chat toward the end. So let's get started with grant research. What does that mean?
So grant research is an integral part of the grant writing process. And so this is really where you're going to begin any type of foray into writing a grant, right? So like you always had to do in school, you had to make sure you had all your facts aligned, you had to make sure that your research was done, all that before you wrote your paper, right? Well, it's the same concept for writing a grant. So you're going to want to research the grant funder's previous awarded grants. So that's the types of projects funded, the average grant awarded, because what you want to be able to do is know kind of what they typically fund, right? You're going to want to be able to know whether or not your project is something that might interest them. And you're also going to want to know if the budget that you're working for on your project fits within their typical giving scale, because not all grantors are going to say, the grant ranges from $5,000 to $25,000. Not everybody's going to tell you that. In fact, a lot of people don't tell you that. So doing this research ahead of time is really, really important.
Yeah, and so a lot of times they'll say we have, $100,000 for this grant, and you think, oh, that means I can apply for $100,000? No, it doesn't usually work that way. So definitely want to look and make sure that you're doing a reasonable ask. And I put on a bullet point there, candid.org. That's a good place you can sign up for to find out some more details about what size of grant that they do, or more specifically, what types of projects they support if you're just sort of cold researching foundations and you haven't actually found a call for letters of interest yet. A lot of times if you go through like GrantStation or something like that, and you search, let's say, well, like I work for a small history museum, so I'll search for something that says like arts and culture, because we do fine arts and we do concerts and we do a variety of things. So I'll go and I'll type in arts New York, because that's where I'm located, and I'll get a bunch of foundations that come up. And then if I look more closely at them, even though they say arts, a lot of them will be specifically to the performing arts, which is not something that my organization does because we don't have really the space for that. So then that one's out of the bucket, but you need to dig to kind of research a little bit more. So candid.org is a really good spot to find a lot of information about these funders. And then of course,
a really good point.
Review anything if you've submitted to this grant before, or even if your organization has in the past. If you're an EMP, you're likely a bit newer to your organization, so it would be well worth your time to research applications that you have done in the past so that you can figure out why they weren't or were accepted before. You want to add anything onto that, Cassandra?
I'll just say this. So I've only been in my position with my current museum for about a year. So I came in new, and the first thing that I did was I went through all of our filing cabinets full of grant proposals to see what did they ask for, right? Because what I typically might think of as a fundable project might not have been how they thought of one, whoever the previous person was, right? And so by researching what you've already submitted and gotten funded or gotten denied, it allows you to understand what your organization has been asking for in the past and whether or not that's a good strategy or whether or not you need to come up with a new strategy. And also it allows you to review how they previously wrote the grant. So if it was really successful and it got fully funded, you might be able to kind of copy that tone in other grant proposals. So that way, you have a better chance.
Yeah, copying that tone, I think, is a really important one. Certain foundations who have been supporting your institution for a long time may just like to support your institution because they view themselves as a long-term patron or something like that. And so if you kind of reword things, it may throw them off a little bit. So just kind of keep doing what you've been doing if it's been working well for you with that particular grant. But when you research grant funders and say that they want to see like progressive things or something else, you're like, oh, this new initiative that my museum is doing is probably going to be a good fit for them. Yeah, and similarly, we apply every year for a conservation grant for an object at my museum. And there was one that we had applied for, I think about 10, 15 years ago that we did not get for a particular object. And I went and reviewed that grant and I thought, oh, okay, well, we can make that argument stronger. And I'm happy to say that last year we got funding for that object that was denied funding in the past. So I guess that would be a good thing to note down is no doesn't always mean no forever. It usually just means no for right now. So I think that's a good segue to our next slide.
So mission alignment, this is another really vital piece when you're trying to put together a grant proposal. You want to make sure that the grant funder's mission aligns with your mission, because if you apply to a grant and it's so far left field, you've wasted your time and you've wasted the funder's time. And that's never good for either of you. We all are very short on time, as we all know. We work in the museum field. No one ever has time. But, so you don't want to waste it by writing a really great proposal that'll never get funded. And so we talk about, how do we know about what their mission is? Well, usually they're going to have what they call funding priorities when they put out their call for proposals, right? So it may be 2 priorities, it may be 5 priorities. Every grant is different, but usually they'll have key funding priorities or focus areas, they also call them. And so these are really, really important for you to kind of hone in on and understand how do those funding areas match with what your museum or your organization does, right?
Yeah, that's really key. Just because you think it makes sense for you to apply to the grant doesn't mean that they're going to see that. So you really want to pick out words from your mission, especially they will look at your website. So look for sections on your website that talk about the things that they want to fund, even if you don't think that are, rather it's your job to convince them, right? So make sure that you're actually doing that. They're not going to be like, oh yes, definitely. You need to be the one to show them why. And you can also ask them. A lot of foundations will actually even require that you have a conversation with them or submit a short letter of inquiry before you actually get access to their full grant proposal system on their website, so that they make sure that nobody's wasting too much of their time. And these people, something that I remember feeling when I very first started writing grants was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't ask questions because then they're going to think I don't know what I'm doing and they're not going to give my organization the money. They want you to have the money. They have this money to give to people, and they want your application to be successful so that they can be happy and give you the money. So unless it specifically says on their website that you can't ask questions because a certain time period has passed, and now they're not allowed to anymore, just to make it fair for everybody, you can usually ask questions and it's not going to make them feel disfavorable to you or your organization.
And I'll also say this too. A lot of funders like you to ask questions because that helps them to get to know your organization. Sending out applications, as Kelsey had said, with like a cold call kind of proposal where you have no interaction with them ahead of time, you have no connection to them at all, can be successful. You can get grants that way, but they're more likely to fund somebody that they've been in contact and conversation with. Because what a lot of people don't know is that the people that you talk to, the program specialist, the grant manager, whatever their title is, they can act as your advocate. If they've had a talk with you and they understand what your mission is, they understand what the project is, they can go back to their organization and say, hey, I think this one is, right up our alley of what we kind of fund, and kind of go up to bat for you. And a lot of organizations really do value that talk beforehand before you turn in your proposal.
That's so true. I'm glad you brought that up. We had put in an application for an ICOM grant. So that's International Council of Museums. And we're a very small historic house museum, and we applied for a grant to help us publish an academic catalog that we're working on. And because I had a previous relationship with some of the people from ICOM, they were able to go to bat for us and say, hey, even though this museum is small, we believe in their work and we think they can handle this. So you really want to make sure that people do understand what you do, and they're excited to know about you and what you do. That's their job.
Yeah, exactly. And the last bullet we haven't really talked about yet, but making a list of examples of how your organization fulfills their mission is really key, because it allows you to have that list at the ready when you then go to write the grant. So you can kind of have that image or idea or concept in your head already of like, I know exactly how I can explain why you need to fund us in these little bullet pointed lists. So it's just a little like trick or tip to help you in the grant writing process further down the road.
Yeah, especially if you have to do one of those 5-page narratives or something, that can really help you structure that. That's a good point.
Yeah.
But before you get any farther, I have this little reminder down there. Does it actually make sense for you to apply for the grant? Sometimes I know that I get really excited about doing all these different things that match with the social mission of my organization, but then I have to step back and think, wait, I don't have that many employees. We already do a lot of stuff. If we get the money, are we going to be able to do a good job with it? Because if you don't do a good job with the money, then that organization is probably never going to fund you again. So make sure that you can actually take on the project if you are to get it.
And I'll also say this too. If you find a grant and it sounds amazing and you're like, oh, I really think we could get it, or I really think we should try to get it, don't try to create new programming or new initiatives to fit the grant. Try to get grants that are going to fit what you're already doing, because then you're just making more work for yourself. And like we said at the beginning, no one has time for that.
Yeah, you often want to support what you're already doing, because we're already doing so much as it is. Yep, that's a good point. All right, well, I think that brings us to the prep work, since we were talking about that bullet pointed list. Yeah, so again, those keywords are key for a reason.
Yeah, so when you're reviewing a grant and you're looking at their call for proposal, you're going to look at the grant criteria and the funder focus, and that sounded really weird, sorry, the funder focus, and pick out 5 to 10 keywords that they write in their grant. So, or their grant call for proposal for grants. So the reason you do this is because you're then going to use those keywords in your grant proposal. You're going to utilize those words as kind of like the buzzwords, that way they understand that you, first of all, read the call for proposal and you're following directions, but 2, that you are making a concerted effort to show how your project, program, whatever, fits that focus, right?
Yep. And like we were saying before, that bullet point of things where you fit their criteria, or past successes that you've had with similar programming, like what you're applying for, or exhibits, or whatever it is, people want to back a winner. Right? Something that I've found people who are new to grant writing tend to do is to say, oh, you know, my organization has such a small budget, we're in an underserved neighborhood. And people do like to know those things because they want to feel like their money is going somewhere where it's needed, but don't make it sound too desperate. This isn't like my neighbor's house burnt down in a terrible fire and we need to get them money because their children have no clothes and they have nowhere to live kind of GoFundMe situation, right? They want to know that their money is going to be successful and that whatever they do with you is going to be sustainable. I've heard from a lot of funders who used to do general operating grants and switched to not doing those anymore because they felt that people were using them as a cash grab. So they got their $15,000 one year and then they had no sustainable way to continue on with that because it was just a one-time thing to sort of pad their general operating budget. And then they needed that again and again. So make sure that you show that you can use this money well. And I find most places now want you to answer the question of how will you sustain this initiative once the grant period is over. So make sure that you show them that you know how to do that and that you have a plan. And you can change things too after it happens because, you know, there might be a pandemic that you weren't expecting. But as long as you show them that you've got a plan, that's what counts for the application stuff.
Yeah, and I'll say too, one of the things I think a lot of new grant writers are afraid to say is they're afraid to tell people in the grant application what problems might arise from doing their project. And that's actually something that grantors want to know. They want to know that, you know, by doing this project, we foresee this obstacle, but this is how we're going to mitigate the situation. So they want to know that you're forward thinking enough to understand that there may be obstacles, there may be challenges, but that you've had the forethought to already think them through and know ways around them if they occur. So that's really important for like your federal grants and some of your bigger grants. They really want to know that you've thought that whole process out.
Definitely. And then that gets to our last point of gathering data, because that can show qualitatively and quantitatively how you have done those things, what your successes in the face of adversity have been, so that people who are trying to give you money will know that it'll be used well. And you're going to need to answer these questions probably both in your narrative as well as in other shorter questions in the grant application. In grant applications, if you haven't taken a deep look at them, we will later, but a lot of it is answering a very similar question 20 different times.
It really is. It's like, sometimes you read through it and you're like, how many ways can they ask the same question? But like Kelsey said, I really think gathering your data is very important, because to be able to know that, for instance, for my museum on a non-pandemic year, we typically serve anywhere from 95 to 100,000 people. And to know that approximately 50 to 52,000 people come through our artworks area, which is designed specifically for children, allows us to know that we can then go out for grants that focus on children, right? Because we have a whole area that is being utilized by 52,000 people that come through our door. That's a huge chunk of people. If we didn't have that data to support that, how would the funder know that that's really a good use of their money? So that data is really important.
They're going to ask for the impact of this grant. How are you going to evaluate the impact of this project? So that's a really good way you can talk about how you're going to do that. And then they also usually ask you what your current level of corporate and foundation supporters are. So make sure that you have that number handy. If you're not it depends on your staffing structure. If you're not the director, or if you don't always have those big picture budgets of the whole organization, depending on what you're applying for, the grant may only need your budget if you're in education or in curatorial, but they may need it for the whole museum. And make sure you ask for that data from your director or from whomever has that sooner rather than later, because you will find that you need to put that into different parts of your grant organization, your grant application, and you don't want to be waiting on somebody else for that information. And also remember that good old adage, your lack of planning in advance is not my problem, or however that's actually phrased. But make sure that when you need to get data from other people, you're not like, oh, I need this real quick. That's not going to help you too much, because that data should be sort of embedded in your mind as you're going through this process. So definitely do your prep work in advance.
And I'll add to that in terms of budgets and understanding who your corporate and private funders are, don't just get the big picture data of that either. Get it broken down, because there's some grantors that want to know how much you're getting from the government. Also, how much are you getting? For some reason, a lot of grantors nowadays are like asking, how much do you get from United Way? And how much do you get from other granting agencies? And sometimes you have to list them out. So you want to make sure that you're able to list them out. So like Kelsey said, you don't want to be waiting to the last second and have to put in 15 different people into this application. If you've already had this prep work done in advance, when you get to that question, you've already got that list right there. You can just plug them right in.
Yeah, and you're going to need that for if they want you to submit a budget as well, because they might say, what other funders or funding sources do you have earmarked for this particular project? Because if you have a project that's $100,000 and you can only apply for, let's say, $7,000 because that's the average grant amount from this organization, they're going to want to know that they're not like throwing money into a pit. What other ways are you going to find to make up the funding needed? And even for something that's not such a big balance, a lot of time they will say like, where are you going to get the rest of the funding for this project? And sometimes it can be like in kind, if it's, I don't know, building a garden and you're going to say that Chase Bank's employees are going to do a volunteer day to help you build the garden. You can do that sort of thing, or even just say if it's a small amount that it'll come from GOS money, like through admissions or something like that, as long as you have the budget to show that that's actually possible. But yeah, you're definitely going to want to know that kind of information for a lot of different stages for your grant. And those are all just like the little questions. Then you also have to write the narrative, and that can be, well, actually, I find the narrative the least time-consuming part, because I'm just really passionate about the project and my museum, so I can write all of that. And also, if you've written a lot of grants, you can copy and paste a lot of those sections about, what is the demographics of your audience, what things like that, or what area, what populations do you serve, what general programs do you have. You can copy and paste that from a lot of other grants that you have written, so that is actually really nice. And even if you don't get funded for this particular grant that you may be writing, you can often reuse some of that language elsewhere. So it's never a waste of time, as long as you do your best.
So before we move on to this slide, we did have a question. So would you recommend to do a SWOT analysis? That's a question.
That's a good question. It depends by what you mean by doing one. Like if you're going to have an outside facilitator come and do it for your whole organization for like a $5,000 grant, no. It's something that you as a grant writer should definitely keep in mind. I would always say definitely when you're writing the grant, focus on the strengths and the opportunities, but definitely put in those other ones so people know that you're being realistic about this stuff. But you have to think about how much time do I have to put into this grant? What is the likelihood of me getting it? And what am I actually going to see? What is my ROI, right? What is my return on investment? So don't get an outside facilitator for a grant that you either don't think is very likely that you'll get, or that is not a lot of money. You can kind of internally do that, and you can talk with somebody else in your museum who works in your same department, or in the budget area or something, talk about that with them. Yeah, did you have any other thoughts about a SWOT analysis, Cassandra? That was my initial reaction.
Just that so as the actual grant writer at my museum, I kind of do this, but not for every grant. What I do is, when I am in my planning mode for the year, where I'm figuring out what we need to plan for, what we need to fund, what type of grants we're going to go after, all that kind of stuff. When I'm in that planning mode, I also do a SWOT analysis of our programs and our funding needs, and like, because it's not always programs that we're funding. So it might be, new security equipment, or it might be new technology or whatever. So I do a SWOT analysis of our funding needs as a whole, and what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses. And the biggest one that I actually focus on when I'm doing the SWOT analysis is what is our threats, because we are not necessarily in a area that has a lot of visual arts museums. We're in an area that has a lot of museums, but not visual arts. So I have to get creative with what would our threats be. And that allows me to then say, okay, if this is a threat, then that allows me to figure out what our impact is going to be from getting the grant. So I actually do a SWOT analysis as a whole in my planning process before I get to the actual grant writing part of it.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, shall we get to the actual grant writing part of it then?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so yeah, like I said, the narrative is my favorite part to write, because then that's kind of like your free space to tell what you want to tell. But you got to make sure that you're really hitting the points that they're asking for. And yeah, be aware of the character and word limits. I remember being taught as a younger person that you shouldn't do contractions in formal writing, that kind of stuff. Forget about it. Put all the don'ts and can'ts and all of that in here, because you're going to want to save your words. Also, my organization has a really long title. If they want you to use your legal name, we have a shorter doing business name. And I always write at the beginning the full name, and then I abbreviate it for the 3 letters, the acronym, and then I just put the acronym throughout the rest of my grant writing. I was kind of surprised when I first started grant writing that you could do those sort of things, because that wasn't the way of formal writing I had been taught, but that is totally appropriate. So don't be afraid to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, a lot of times for me, the tricky part is, because I am so passionate about what I'm writing about, and I do love the projects that we're trying to fund, is sticking to that character or word limit. Sometimes, they give you 1,000 characters, and that sounds like a lot, but it's really not. And so you get in there and you start typing and you start writing, and you're like, oh, this is so good. I'm so good. Oh, it's going to get funded. Yeah. And then you're like 2,000 characters. And you're like, well, okay, what can I cut? Right. So just be very conscious of character and word limits. But I'll also say, don't feel like you have to limit yourself when you start to write. Don't be like, oh, I only have 1,000 characters, so I'm just going to cut it off short, even though I know I want to say this. Just say it all and then edit.
I take the same approach to this as I do with exhibit text writing, right? You know that you have to say a lot of really important things in a short amount of space, because nobody's going to read an essay on the wall. You only have 200 words for that. So yeah, write everything that you want to say so that you make sure that what you think is important is on the page. And then you can usually figure out, once you've kind of had that almost brain dump moment, you can know how to phrase it more concisely, or what maybe isn't super important to say, or what maybe, because you're so passionate, you have actually said twice. And you can kind of reorganize as well to make sure that, I often find that when you reorganize your writing, you can improve the transitions and make it shorter that way, because then you're not kind of circling back to things that maybe were in your head that you came out later. You can figure out a more concise way of organizing your narrative.
Yeah, that's very true. So when you're doing the proposal narrative, not only do you have to be aware of the character and word limits, but you're also going to want to make sure that you kind of have a running list of questions that you're trying to answer. Sometimes granting agencies will give you a list of questions that they want you to answer in the grant narrative, and that's, wonderful, because then you're like, okay, let's make sure I hit that, make sure I hit that. But if they don't, you kind of have to have these questions already preconceived in your mind of what you're trying to answer, right? So what the project is, why should they fund the project, your success strategies and your need, and then the impact of the project. So that's kind of your go-to questions that you're answering in this proposal narrative if they don't give you a set of questions.
Yeah, and even if you've already answered a separate question about the impact of the project or whatever, it's worth saying again, going back to the idea of writing exhibit text. Nobody reads everything in an exhibit. And I kind of doubt that grant writers read everything that you say, or if they do, it's always good to remind them of what they've read before, because they read a ton of these. And also sometimes they may have an idea in their head of what your organization is based on what type of museum it is or something like that. Or if you have a previous relationship with them, they're going to be like, oh, why is this historic house museum asking for like an environmental grant? Because that's, for example, that's a new initiative that we're doing at my museum. We started a few years ago. So you want to make sure that you're kind of hitting them with those key points. Again, remember, this is why it's impactful. Remember, this is why we can do this grant. Remember why this matches our mission, even if you've already said those things.
Yeah, and I think, our third bullet point, create an outline of what important points you need to hit. That is really effective way of whittling down your proposal narrative that you've written that's 4,000 characters for a 1,000 character limit. So once you've written your narrative, then you can go back to your outline and be like, okay, did I hit this point? Did I hit this point? Did I hit this point? Okay, everything else is fluff, right? Get rid of all of that stuff. You don't need it because it's excess and it's something that the grantors don't want to read, because like Kelsey said, they have a ton to read. They don't have time to sit through and sift through an essay. So they want it short, sweet, concise, and to the point.
Yeah, exactly. I think we should, for the interest of time, get to the point too.
Yeah.
And we're going to skip ahead to our next slide, editing the narrative.
So like we were saying, you're going to want to edit down. The way I do it is I write the narrative, I edit right away. Then I leave the document 2 to 5 days. I come back, I edit again. Then I send it to somebody else that I work with. They review it. Then I send it to somebody who has absolutely nothing to do with my organization. They review it. I take all of these edits, kind of figure out what I think makes sense, what doesn't make sense, review it for a final time. And that's kind of my process.
Yep, I think that's a really good one. Let's see, I added these questions. Sometimes when you're writing something really passionately at 2 a.m, speaking for a friend, you realize that what you've written only makes sense to you because you know what you want to do. Right? So when you reread it, make sure that if somebody who's never even heard of your organization read this, they would know what you're talking about, right? Don't say like, oh, because of this, this, and this, it'll make sense. If people don't already know that your museum, serves a large Spanish-speaking population, and you put something in there about wanting to have programs in Spanish or hire part-time people to facilitate that or something like that. Make sure that everything that you know and that you need to, that makes this important to you is actually written down, because sometimes when something's so important to you, you forget that it's not something that is common knowledge.
That's true. And then the last one you put on here, did you actually answer the questions, is really important, because sometimes you get writing and you think you've answered everything and you go back and you read it and you realize, no, I didn't actually answer question 3. I just talked a lot on question 2. So it's really good to go back to those original questions we had listed or the questions that they give you and just really double check that you've actually answered it.
Yeah, and rereading those to make sure that you were answering the question they were actually asking, because sometimes if you've written a bunch of grants, you're going to, kind of be like, okay, so they're asking about the population served and the programs and all that stuff. And, you think that you answered the question, but when you re-look at their questions, they may have actually been asking for something slightly different. So don't get, even though I said before, you can often copy and paste, make sure it's kind of like when you send out a resume, right? You send out your basic resume to different jobs that you want to apply for, but you tweak it. So make sure that you're doing that. So I think with all of that, should we get some practice going here?
I think we should.
All right. So if you want to unmute yourselves and or turn on your video, feel free to do that. We're going to take a look at 3 different grants right now. let's see if I can actually take us to these grants. Nah, do it the old school copy and paste way. Okay. Here we go. So if you actually want to click on these links yourself as well, so you can read it at your own speed, feel free to do that. This is that grant actually that I was talking about where we didn't get it one year and then we got it another year for the same object. I really like this grant, and I wanted to show you this one as an example of a very good grant. It's pretty short and the questions are fairly clear. Right, they want these kind of information, you know, that sort of data collecting stuff that we talked about, and then here we get into the narrative. So you can see these questions are quite straightforward, and you know, we're going to take a look at some other grants that are maybe not so straightforward. This is the nicest one that I have ever applied to in terms of the questions are really easy to answer. You know exactly what they're asking for. And then they, you know, you get to write, I like this kind of question, like, you know, why now? Which is something that you might want to be thinking about for any type of grant that you write. You know, our organizations have often existed for hundreds of years. Why is it important to do this project or this initiative now? Why should this organization support your project now?
And I also think that's a good point, Kelsey. Why now? Because we're in a pandemic now. So that's going to be an even more important question of why are you choosing to do this right now in the midst of the pandemic? How is it going to help your organization? How is it going to help your community? What is the greater impact of doing it now versus doing it 2 years from now? Like, they really are going to start looking for that.
Yeah. All right. So Cassandra, did you want to do maybe the more difficult one for asking people to pull out that information that we were talking about?
Yeah.
So this one's a little clear. I wanted to show you that one as sort of like the dream that you get for grant applications, but that is not always the case. Let's load this one. Let's see. All right, Cassandra, let me know when where you want me to scroll here.
Oh, I don't see it. I still see the Hudson.
Oh, that's because when I clicked on it, it opened in a new window. So that was not the sharing window. Sorry about that, guys. There we go. Now you can see it, right?
Okay. Go ahead and scroll down. So this grant is from the Hyundai Motor Manufacturing of Alabama. It's our Hyundai plant here in Montgomery. And the reason why I chose this one is because it tells you exactly how many characters you have right there. It's a box. So once you go over, it's like, it's all red. But it's not real specific, right? So provide a brief description of your charitable organization. Well, what does that mean? Like, are you asking for the history of it? Are you asking for our programmatic, themes? Are you asking for what was our programmatic slate last year? Like, what are you asking for, right? So this was actually something that I looked back, because we had gotten a grant from these people before. So I had to go back and look and see what other people had written, because I was confused. I was like, I don't know really what they're asking for there. And so it turned out they were asking for like a brief history of our organization. So they wanted to know like when we were founded, which for us, it was 1930, and we were actually founded under a different name. And so that's really important for us to put in there. And then they wanted to know things like who do we serve? So that was also in there, which I never would have put in there had I not looked back and seen what other people had written. So this is an example of something that's very kind of vague, but yet they do give directions, but it's very vague.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to do some like digging and thinking of what does that mean, right? So then the next one, details of donation request. Provide a brief description or summary of your request. Now, this one, you think it would be straightforward. Okay, I'm going to write about, for instance, for us, we applied for this grant to get audio tours translated into Korean and Spanish. And, so you think, okay, I'm just going to write about the audio tours here. And how does that better our museum, and why do we want to do it, and blah, blah, blah. But they also want to know like the very kind of nitty gritty specifics as well. So they wanted to know our timetable for it. So we plan on doing, starting this project in May and ending it in, whenever. And so just because it doesn't say give us a date doesn't mean that they don't want to know what your timetable is for your overall project. So be aware of that when you're thinking about this type of writing, that you are going to have to put those timetables in, even if they're not asking you for them. If you can scroll down a little bit. And then, so what will be the primary use of funds if provided? This is something we were just talking about, right? Kind of asking the same exact question again, because they're pretty much saying, okay, you've told us the project, you've told us your timeline, you've told us all this. How are you going to use the funds? So if we fund your audio tour, how are you going to use the funds? Okay, well, we're going to use them because we're going to hire an outside consultant, and we're going to do 3 of these, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And again, it's going to take us this long, which is why it costs us this much money. So it's kind of a combination between the question we just looked at and kind of like a budget justification of how exactly are the funds going to be spent. So it's kind of a dual question there. Let's see what else. So this one, scroll back up just a little bit. There you go. Briefly describe why this request should be granted to your organization. This question right here is exactly what Kelsey was talking about in terms of impact. So although it doesn't say impact, that's what they mean. They're saying, what is the impact of your organization, right? So that is exactly what you're going to write in this little box, is you're going to explain, by funding us, this is what's going to happen to our community, to our museum, to our visitors, whatever. That's really kind of that whole gist. And then the next one, what are your goals of the program and sponsorship? This is where it really comes in handy to understand your overall funding goals. And that's really why I kind of do the SWOT analysis at the beginning, because it allows me to know what our goals are in general for the museum. So I can always pull at least 1 or 2 general goals that are going to fit anything that I'm trying to fund. And then I only have to come up with maybe 1 or 2 more that's specific to the program project that I'm trying to get funded. So it allows me to say, like, look at all these great goals we've done, but I've only really had to come up with 1 or 2 instead of all 4. So that's kind of why I do that SWOT analysis ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because if you look at this question, what are the goals, and then what are the specific activities? Those almost sound like they're the same question, right? But okay, the goals are, I don't know, increase accessibility to people with limited English proficiency. That's the goal. Then the specific activity is to translate our audio guides into Spanish and Korean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like your goals and your objectives and your outcomes and your outputs, right? It's like all those language that you have to kind of understand, what does it actually mean? Because a goal is that actually very different than your outcome, and your outcome is different than your output. So it's like understanding what all those terms mean and knowing what question to put it in and in what order, basically.
Yeah, understanding foundation lingo is
right. Yes.
It takes some getting used to.
It does. It really does. And so this is an interesting grant because they don't specifically tell you what range they're going to fund you in, and which is why it's important to do that prep work. But what they will do is they say, what is the low range you will accept, and what is the high range that you're hoping to get? And then they typically give you something in between. And so if you haven't done that research ahead of time, you don't know what really to put in either of those. So
Yeah.
that's why we're saying do it ahead of time.
And that seems a little unusual to have the range. I have not had a grant that phrases it that way, but I definitely have had similar kind of things, because let's say, oh, I've had a question on a grant that was like, if you don't get fully funded, how are you gonna do this project? So that, you know, because you would think, well, a low range, well, I'll take anything, but no, because you still have to do what you promised you said you were going to do. But if your project costs $20,000 and you can only rustle up 8,000, how can you do that project on that budget? You need to have a plan for that. So that's kind of what they're asking here, and what you'll see phrased differently elsewhere that means the same thing.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because when I first saw this grant, I immediately thought, I don't know, whatever the lowest thing I can hit on, I don't know. And, you know, but then after talking with our director of development, we came to that same conclusion, like, no, you have to be able to still do the project. So like, if it's for us, it was a $20,000 project. And the lowest I put down was 10,000, because at 10,000, I can cut X, Y, Z and still be able to fund the majority of what we need to get done. And then we can use our reserves, or use, you know, something else to be able to fill in the gap of maybe $2,000 to get it up to 12,000, which is really the bare minimum that we can afford to do it at. So Kelsey's right. Always kind of keep that in your mind. This is another question we haven't really talked about yet, Kelsey, but is important. People want to know how you're going to thank them. They're going to want to know, how are they going to be recognized for contributing to this project? So kind of have that at the ready too, and don't wait to the last minute to ask that from your PR person or your executive director or whoever. Get that stuff ahead of time so you can, and that is really something you can copy and paste. Once you have it once, it goes everywhere, because it's not going to change. You're pretty much going to give everybody the same thing once, you know, they fund you. You might have special circumstances where, you know, maybe if it's at the $20,000 level or higher, then maybe you do something extra that you don't do for people that, you know, give you $5,000 or something. And that, you know, you can just add that in quickly. But for the most part, it's copy and paste on that question, but it's really important to get that ahead of time. Again, like Kelsey said, have they sponsored us before? If yes, how much? And the years provided. Again, that's all that data. So all of this is really to say, understand what they're asking you. If you don't understand what they're asking you, reach out, call someone, email somebody, and find out. Because the worst thing you can do is think you know what they're asking and answer the question based on what you think they're asking, and it actually be the wrong assumption. And then you didn't answer the question. So.
Yeah. All right. So I was thinking that we could throw people in the deep end, because sometimes that's going to happen. And let's take a look at this IMLS grant and see if we can ask anybody to participate and try to pull out some of these key points for this grant. So let me pull this up. Oh, that loaded quickly. It's such a big PDF. Okay. So here's a really yummy grant. IMLS grants. They are time consuming. Here's just the table of contents. It's 40 some pages. That's fun. And you want to read it. And then this, you know, we didn't really talk about this, but sometimes, well, actually almost all the time, grants will not support backdated projects, right? So make sure that whatever you're applying for to do this is something that you will not be starting until the time you're allowed to start it, if you actually want to apply the grant funds to this. Okay, so there we go. What are the indicators of successful projects? So I was actually thinking, yeah, let's go through this a little bit. And if anybody would like to try to pick out some keywords, I think we should, let's pretend that we are all working at a mid-sized art museum in Minnesota that has a substantial collection of early American art. Okay, so we all work at the Minnesota Art Museum that has an American art wing or something like that, early American. And by that, I mean like, 1700s through 1850s. Okay, so here is the section that's really key, the IMLS agency level goals. So if we're working for this museum and we want to come up with a project for this grant, or we want this grant rather to fund our project, let's say we want to, I don't know, Cassandra, what should we do with our American art?
It's a good question. Let's say that we want to.
Oh, here we go. Here's an easy one. Let's do increased public access. Are you cool with that?
Yeah, that's where I was thinking. I was trying to think of something specific, but yeah.
Yeah, so let's say we want to increase public access. And let's see. Oh, Jesse said something in the chat about collections.
Online collections.
Yeah, that's a great one. All right, so we're going to put our collections online. All right, so look, we are a mid-sized museum with an early American art collection in Minnesota with that we want to put our collection online. So how are we going to show IMLS that our project to do this online collections database that the public can access is going to increase public access? So let's go through this, and if you would like to either drop it in the chat or unmute yourself and just shout it out, what are some key words that we should be noting for our narrative? So let's take a minute, we can read this.
Dina says inclusion.
Great, yeah.
Sean says enabling discovery and address access barriers.
Great, yeah, so I feel like already we're getting to kind of our list of questions we want to answer. Great, great. Let's see. Yeah, there we go, enhancing access. Yep, that's just kind of like what Sean was saying. All right, so we're going to scroll down a little bit because our project is under this collection stewardship and access type of project. Digital preservation. Oh my goodness, what just happened?
I think maybe you clicked on
Did I click on something?
Yeah, the sample application.
Oh, whoops, not doing that. Oh no, all the way back. Okay.
School groups, educational resources.
Did I scroll down too far?
Yeah, we're right there.
Okay, right here. Okay. I've actually had a call with these IMLS folks a few months ago, and they are not real big on digital preservation. Definitely not. Yeah. Yeah, okay, would you find only one category for it to fit? How about it also feeds lifelong learning? That's a really good question that I also asked these IMLS people. They have a similar grant for this, but specifically for small museums. So that's the one I applied for because working for a small museum, I thought it would be harder to compete against the big boys by doing this grant, which is basically the exact same, but for everyone of all sizes. But the impact that my museum that's quite small can have is going to be different than somebody with a $3 million budget. So that's why I went for that type of grant, but thought this one would be more broadly applicable to whoever is joining us tonight. And so when I spoke to them on the phone, and again, you can just call them, even though this is the IMLS and they seem like big and scary because they're like government, they're super nice and they want to see good applications, right? So don't feel afraid to call them. And it is, I was asking them, like, some of these things that we want to do seem like they are going to overlap with these categories.
Yeah.
These categories, yeah, but they artificially created these categories so that they could understand the projects, and they're going to look at all of the ones for this category and all the ones for that category. And they said that if you kind of mention about it overlapping a bit, that's not going to give you a way bigger step up, like, oh, look, my project gets all 3 categories. But they do kind of like to see that you're thinking about all of these things. So even if something, like a community anchor is what we ended up applying for my museum. This our Minnesota American Art Museum, maybe if you think that the digital collections project speaks to some of those other parts of the grant, you have the space, you can put that in, but also make sure that you're not too like all over the place, right? You want to make sure that it's focused. And even if you know that it applies to those things, you want to put in what is the strongest argument. So if you're kind of being like, oh, and it's like this, and it's good for this, and it's good for that, it's good that you know that, but you want to give them the big hitters. Don't distract them with those things.
You want to be strategic with how you phrase it, right? So you may want to include that it fits this and it fits that, but only when it bolsters something that you're already saying.
Right, exactly. Don't try to be like hitting all of the points, because it's sort of a question of like, what can you do really well? Like, should you do 3 things really well or 20 things kind of meh? So the previous one is what you want to do. Even though I think a lot of us get really excited about our institutions and we want to do everything for the grant writing, like rein it in and just tell them the heavy hitting arguments. So then this is nice because they give you some recently funded applications. So I guess that's what I accidentally clicked on before. So definitely take a look at all of those. That is really, really helpful to figuring out the kind of language that other people have used to successfully apply for this type of grant. All right, so we've got our keywords. So, okay, here we go. This is nice that they tell you this up front. That's super great. So that's a pretty nice chunk of money. How much money do you think we should apply for our project? Jesse, I know you said that you'll stop, but you just did or no, Laura, you just did the digitization. So maybe you can give us an idea of budget for that. Yeah, I really don't know. So this is where you'd have to do some research. If you're starting from scratch, like, okay, we really want to do this project, but we don't have the money and it's quite expensive. You have to think about your web hosting costs, what kind of platform you're going to do. Like if you're already using, say, Past Perfect and you want to just do their online thing, that is not that hard to find that kind of information about that, what that's going to cost. But if you want to do a custom project or some other thing that you might want to do, because Past Perfect is not the most beautiful looking all the time, because it's sort of an old-fashioned sort of program. So do your research for that. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people around 50, 60, 70K. Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Are we planning on employing people specifically for this project? Sometimes the grant will say something about like what key staff people are going to be doing this project. What consultants are you going to do on this project? And I've also had this conversation with the INLS folks. Like, do we need a consultant? I really would rather prefer to pay my actual staff and not hire somebody to do web development when I have a staff member who, although that's not her job title, is quite skilled at web development, and she did our whole website. And they were like, oh, that's fine. So just make sure that you kind of say that sort of thing. But yeah, if you do need somebody, let's say you don't have anybody on staff who writes in Korean really well, and you want to make sure that your digital collections, let's say you're, or what's a Hmong, there's a lot of Hmong folk who live in Minnesota. You want to write it in their language so that they can understand it and have increased access to your project. So it's not only online, so people don't have to go to the museum physically to see it if they're doing research or just want to check it out, but let's put it in different languages. Maybe you don't have anybody who speaks fluent Hmong on your staff and you want to hire a consultant to do that. Yes, you can definitely add that in. And then also, of course, add in, your time. So you, if you're project managing this, add in your staff, your hours that's going to cost, a percentage of other things that you can add in. So like a percentage of your audit cost, a percentage of your benefits, all of those kind of things, as long as they are not specifically listed as unfundable aspects, then you can definitely put that in there. A lot of times they'll say we don't fund staff salaries, which is kind of irritating. It's like, well, how you expect me to do this project? But,
Yeah, but you can, but on that note, you can put it as your contribution match, your cost share
Yeah.
match.
yeah,
So if somebody says, you know, you have to have a 1-to-1 match, what that means is if you ask for 50,000, you have to give 50,000, right? So you have to be able to match whatever you're asking for. And a really easy way of kind of bolstering up your match without actual money is to put in your staff time, to put in your volunteer hours, to do all that stuff that Kelsey was just talking about, but put it on your cash cost share side of the equation.
Yeah, exactly. And even if it isn't a grant that requires a match of 1-to-1, or sometimes it's often not 1-to-1, it's like 2-to-1 or something, so you do half of what they're funding, you can put that in your budget of like, okay, well, the rest of it is staff salary, and we're going to, that's our in-kind contribution, because we would be paying that anyway, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, someone had a question. I want to get to it before. How do I scroll up on this thing? Oh, there we go. Okay. It said, what did they say?
Oh, Tiffany's question?
I think maybe.
Are agencies likely to offer you less than you asked for? Yeah, that's a really good question. You want to tackle that one, Cassandra?
Yeah, so let me find the question again. Okay, are agencies likely to offer you less than you ask for, or just reject you outright if you ask for too much? Yes. If they feel that your budget cannot be justified, then they are going to give you less, or they might say that you haven't taken a serious enough look at your actual costs and expenditures and not fund you because they might think that you are not going to be successful or wise with the money. Your budget is something that even the smallest granting agency takes extremely seriously, and they look at your budget versus your expenditures versus what you say you're going to cost. And if you're, for instance, if you're asking for, say, $20,000 for a project and your expenses equal $19,000, right there is a red flag that you didn't even edit to make sure that your budget matched what you're asking for. So you really want to make sure that the amount that you're asking for, one, not only makes sense, but two, matches your expenditures, and three, falls within their typical range.
Yeah, now
or falls around it.
Yeah, you do want to ask for more than you need, though. And I often find that I ask for more than I need by sort of like, not really, I guess, overestimating the staff hours that it's going to take or something, but you never know, right? Like it might often take more staff hours than you think. So you'll often, let's say you ask for 15,000, they'll give you 10. Like if it's still a reasonable ask, they're not going to reject you because they can't meet your full ask as long as it's reasonable.
And on that note of like asking for more than you might actually need when it comes down to like dollars and cents when you figured out your budget, just make sure that they can't see that you've asked for more than what you actually need. Like don't itemize it line by line and then have it be something that doesn't make sense in terms of like, okay, typically this is what this activity costs. So say you get a consultant in and they typically require $100 an hour, but you're saying you're going to pay them $200 an hour because you're trying to get more than what you need. That's a red flag for them. Why are you paying them double their typical, like what other people are typically paying? So just be careful when doing that.
Yeah. Oh, and that's another good point, that if you are employing consultants or stuff like that, you often need a letter of commitment for the grant. So again, don't do it last minute.
Yeah.
Okay. Which actually can be sort of stressful too, because if it's like, you don't want to get somebody's hopes up that you're going to give them this project if you don't get the grant. So make sure that when you're speaking to those people, you let them know that kind of thing. Like, be just really open about it. This is something important to take a look at. A lot of times when you're writing grants, this one you submit all online, but a lot of times you'll need to do it like in triplicate and in paper, and you want to make sure you have the right headings because they're really picky about that. Even though it seems kind of silly, they really are. But in this one, even the PDFs that you upload have to have these very specific names. So make sure you pay attention to all of those kind of details. Lots of supporting documents. Sometimes, something that we didn't even think about, but I don't know if this has it. Oh yeah, you're gonna need resumes of the key project staff and consultants. So you're gonna definitely need to identify those folks beforehand. Oh shoot, I just lost what I was gonna say. Something that we didn't discuss before. Oh yes, letters of support. This one doesn't necessarily give you a space for letters of support, but a lot of like state government grants through like economic development organizations will ask for letters of support. If you have never asked for a letter of support for somebody before, a really good tip is to actually write it for them and then just say like, here's a template, feel free to edit it as needed and then sign and send back, please, once you already ask them if they're comfortable with writing that, because ain't nobody got time to do your work for you. I really don't care for it when people ask me to write a letter of support and don't give me at least a list of bullet points they want me to address, but it's so much better if they give me like a pre-written thing and then I can just sort of zhuzh it up and personalize it.
Yes, and so we recently just applied to an IMLS grant in November, and we had, because we had a lot of community partners that were going to be a part of this project. And so I think I ended up with maybe 9 letters of support. And so trying to wrangle all those people to get it back to you in a manageable amount of time is really difficult, especially if they're writing it. So it's just so much easier if you've already written it for them and you just say, hey, and for what I do is I highlight exactly where I want them to edit. And I say, this is the part where you put in what you will offer us. And I kind of I highlight it and I put it in a bracket and I say, explain how your involvement in the project will attribute or contribute to our intended impact or our intended outcome or whatever. I explain right there what I want them to say. So that way they're not really having to think too much about it. It's really more about what did they bring to the table? And they already know what they're bringing to the table, right? They know because you've had that conversation with them. So it's easy for them to go in there, type that, sign it, send it to you. Super easy.
Yeah. So then let's go back to our Minnesota Art Museum. Here's the proposal narrative. Again, they're just going to chop it off if it's too many pages. Consider each narrative question. So let's go. So you have to pay attention also to how they have organized these things, because it's number 6 proposal narrative, and then all of a sudden you get down to project justification. So, but there's no number. Oh, that means that that's part of the proposal narrative. I'm a big fan of keeping headings in my narratives. If they have the heading on their kind of template for you, keep that heading in there, because that's going to help you organize your thoughts and it's going to help them read what you have to say. So let's see. Anybody want to take a stab at answering some of these project justification questions? I think this is the most important part of writing pretty much any grant. What need, problem, or challenge will our collections digitization project address, and how was it identified? I like this question because it shows that they want to support projects that actually matter to your organization and that are going to make an impact, related to your strategic plan, not just kind of a cash grab, like, oh, we could digitize our collections because there's this grant opportunity for it. Why is it important for us to identify? Or how did we know that this was a need that our organization had? Is it just because we didn't have them digitized? Just because they're not digitized doesn't mean that there's a need or a problem with that. My museum doesn't have their collections digitized. We're not really like a collection museum or a historic house, so I don't see that that's a big need for us. So we haven't done anything with that yet, for example. Something, obviously we would like to do because we think it'd be nice, but they're not going to fund me just because I think it would be nice. Does anybody want to take a stab at that? Okay, I see somebody in the chat. Great, access to collections has been limited due to COVID-19. That's really good. You might want to say, like, researchers haven't been able to access these collections. Artists who come and like to look at these for inspiration that you have worked with before. Educators who usually go on field trips. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you might have done a visitor survey. Yeah, actually doing visitor surveys is really helpful, because then you can say, yeah, people in my community actually said this. You can actually even look at your Google reviews. I have found, a lot of people, in my case, not for my pretend Minnesota organization, but for my real one in New York, people in our reviews often mention the park that we're in and how much they love the park, because there's not a lot of green space where we are. So we say, oh, okay, people really like the park, so I can use quotes from those Google reviews that we didn't even solicit to say when I want to build a grant or build a garden and write a grant for that this is a need that our community has. So that's kind of a nice way you can maybe do some research. Even
we
if you
do the same thing, actually. We look at our Google reviews a lot. And we also, now that we're in the pandemic season and we're doing a lot of virtual programming, we look at the comments on Facebook that people put for our virtual programming, because it allows us to say that, for instance, we just had a creative conversations where we had the artist come in and kind of do like an artist talk, but she really explained her process and her thought behind it and stuff like that. And so the comments were like, wow, this was enlightening, or I didn't understand that process and now I do. And so that allowed us to really push the educational angle that people are learning from us, even in a virtual setting. So
yeah, that's great.
Use what you can.
Yeah, okay. So then this is a really nice grant, even though it kind of makes it feel a little overwhelming because it's so long, but it not only tells you what questions that they want you to answer, but what they're going to be grading your answers on. So that's really nice. So let's, we're kind of coming up on time here. So let's see if anybody wants to take a stab for our Minnesota Museum. How will our project address the goals of Museums for America program and align with the project category you have chosen? So a lot of times, this goes back to actually our very kind of first slide about what are the funding priorities, right? So even though this is an IMLS grant and you're applying for this collections access grant, it's all under this goal that IMLS has called Museums for America. So you're gonna actually have to go and research that, and they tell you right here to support projects that strengthen the ability of an individual museum to serve its public. So anybody want to take a stab on answering how our collections digitization project for our Minnesota Museum strengthens our ability to serve our public? You can either put it in the chat or just shout it out. I know these are a little bit tricky because they're sort of big grants, but we thought that throwing you in the deep end might be a good way to get you thinking about grant language, especially that they like to use, like what we were talking about with the Hyundai grant.
And if you practice on a kind of big, scary grant, then when you go to write your smaller grants, you're not as nervous.
And you'll have often answered many of those questions from the smaller grant in this one because it has so many things they want you to say. So
that is so true. Yes,
one.
I have taken a lot from what I applied for in November and been able to kind of reuse it, especially things like the history of the organization, or how did the project address our strategic plan. It made me really think about how do our projects align with our strategic plan. Oh, let's see. Sean said, bridge a relationship between the museum and the local community. Michelle says, increases access to our collections, especially during the pandemic when the museum is closed.
Yep, so I think for Sean's one, that's a really good starting point. So something I mentioned is that there's a lot of Hmong people in Minnesota. So one of the things that we were going to do is hire in my imaginary grant that we're writing, we're going to put our collections online, and somebody had wrote about putting alt text and things like that to increase accessibility. So we're also going to be translating all of our text into Hmong. So, this will help bridge a relationship between the museum and the local community, because all of this art is, early American art that maybe doesn't have any particular significance to the Hmong community because they came here in the 1970s, and don't have that sort of like Americana cultural background. But this will help them have access to that and maybe learn more about it. And that sort of bridge, can be built that way. So you want to say those sort of buzzwords like we talked about, like build a relationship, and then say how you're going to do that.
And I think that Michelle's point is important too, because she says it increases our access to collections. So she's using a buzzword, increase access, because that was one of the things that we kind of talked about earlier, is that that's something they want. They want to increase access. They want to break down access barriers, right? So if we use that language that they've already said and set up for us, it kind of triggers in their, the grant reader's mind that you're really paying attention and making sure that your grant aligns with what they're doing. Laura says, can we pretend it's a university museum with limited hours? More access to our collections for people who've had a hard time coming out to see your museum during your open hours.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, even if it's not a university museum, maybe they have limited open hours because they don't let so many people in at a time for COVID regulations or something like that. So yeah, definitely. Or yeah, during your regular opening hours, if you don't have late nights, people who are working can't come see you. That's a really good one. And then, okay, Dana had a good question. We are able to reach a broader audience outside of our local community, or is this a case where they want to know how it impacts local communities? And yeah, Jesse kind of piggybacked on that too. Expands your audience to the whole world, not just those who could ever come because of geographical limitations. Yeah, I think putting both of those is really helpful. It just kind of depends what you really want this to do, right? So like my kind of vision of having it in languages that welcome in your local community who might not be comfortable speaking or reading in English, then you don't want to kind of just throw out there, and this will help people all over the world access this. But you can also kind of go back to that like Museums for America idea and enhancing objects, and you might say like this is part, we want our collections to be online because we also, let's say we are not a university museum, but say the University of Minnesota also has a significant collection of American art and their stuff is online. So we want to be able to partner with them and have their students be able to research stuff that's in their museum and in our museum so that they can have a wider collection to understand this time period in art, or it's, that sort of thing. So if it's relevant to the grant, definitely put that kind of stuff in there. But yeah, that sometimes I think as museum people, we can be a little bit, especially like when we first start as EMPs, a little like kumbaya-y, like, oh, museums are great, like art and culture for the world. And you have to remember that that's really nice. But unfortunately, that like, you have to be realistic about these things too. So, but something that you could actually say that would probably be relevant to say, yes, of course, this does, expand our audience to the whole world. You may say that although that's not the primary goal of this, it's something that you're thinking of and how you can connect your collections with the collections of other institutions in your region or even globally. And that can be where you talk about the long-term effects of this or how the project will be sustainable over time. So you might want to put those things in, but they may just not fit in certain areas. So that's kind of what Cassandra was saying earlier, write everything that you want to say out and then edit it, reformat it. And you might have some ideas that, you have to kind of kill your darlings, or you can save them and put them in other sections where they're going to be more impactful or relevant. Anything else you want us to practice? You can either throw that in the chat right now or things that you think we should practice, Cassandra, before we go into more open Q&A.
I don't, just an issue of like, for time's sake. I think we should open it up to Q&A and just see what people are kind of thinking about or have questions about, or. So the floor is yours.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This was the first of 6 seminars I saw. When are the others?
We were thinking of having them monthly, but I'm glad you asked that question, because if people think that that's too often because everybody's really busy, we can make them bi-monthly, or if people want it sooner, we can try to hustle up and make them a bit quicker. Yeah, we want to get your feedback on that. And also, what we have ideas of what we want to address in the rest of the 5-part series, but if there's things that you want us to cover, please drop that in the chat.
We have another question. Where will we be able to access this recording after?
The NEMPN website.
How important is quantitative support, maybe from visitor evaluation studies? Does it depend on the grant?
Well, let's see. I'll just answer that quickly, and then you can add on to that, Cassandra. It does depend on the grant. They often will ask not only about the impact, but about how you evaluate. And we often will say something like, oh, the visitor data that we get in terms of like how many people come is used, but also qualitative, like from visitor evaluation studies. So yeah, it definitely depends on the grant, the foundation, what you can kind of figure out about their priorities, as well as what your actual project is.
Yeah, and for federal grants, you're going to need the quantitative support. They're going to want to know how you came about that. For a lot of your bigger kind of grants, they want to know that. But I also would say even just being able to keep that quantitative data on hand for your smaller grants is really helpful, because even if they don't ask you for it, you usually can find a space to slip it in somewhere.
Yeah, they're gonna like it even if they don't ask for it. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Please do in the chat comment if monthly for these is going to work for you guys. If you want to stick around for the rest of the series, please let us know if a monthly schedule is going to work. Let's see. How many grants do you write a year? That's a really hard question, because I'm the director of the museum, and I have 2 other staff members who are full-time, so like as many as I have time for. Cassandra a little bit different because that's her main job role. It really depends on your institution, and also think about what is your success percentage, and again, going back to that little point of, can you actually handle all of these projects? So I don't think that there's a good answer for that. I mean, it also depends on your role, right? Like when I was a curator, I only wrote a handful of grants a year because I was writing things specifically to get objects restored or for exhibit funding. So.
And I think it also depends too on the structure of your organization. So like we have curators, but they don't write grants. And we have, people in our development department, but they don't write grants. So, and it's because that's my dedicated job, is to write the grants. Of course they help and I get lots of information from everybody, but I'm responsible for actually writing the grants. So for me, it's hard to say how many I write a month, because it kind of actually ends up being like lumped into certain months that are more than other months for me. It might be like all of a sudden I have 6 grants that are all due within 2 weeks of each other. So I'm really writing, but then it might be I have a 2-month break. And of course I'm doing my research and gathering stuff, but I'm not necessarily writing it for that full 2 months. Yeah. So it kind of really depends on when the grant deadlines are.
Yeah, we're going to have another section of our course series that talks about the grant schedule, and we can kind of talk more about that, researching, writing the grant, getting the grant, reporting. You sometimes have to do an interim report and then a final report, that kind of stuff. So we will talk more about that. And I think that sort of answers a question that somebody else had on here. About if a project ends up costing less than what you are budgeted, are you obligated to return the extra money? Technically, yeah, but nobody wants you to do that because that's a pain in the butt for everybody. I have had grant people who say, if you end up getting something donated rather than you have to pay for it, just like find some other way to spend the money and let us know beforehand, and we'll be like, okay, that sounds great. So if you've got the money, you don't want to get it.
And that's actually happening a lot right now due to COVID. So I've already reached out to 3 or 4 grantors and told them, due to COVID, we weren't able to do X, Y, and Z because we can't have people in our galleries and because we were shut down for 8 months. So that meant we weren't able to do portions of what we had planned to do. And they all, but what I find useful is come to them with what you want to do. Don't say like, well, we have extra money. What do you want us to do? Say we, due to whatever circumstances, we now have X amount of money left over. This is our new proposed project or new proposed use of funding.
Right. Don't make them do your work for you.
Right. And as long as it aligns with their mission and it kind of is around the same parameters that you originally had applied for, 9 times out of 10, they're just gonna be like, yeah, go ahead, that's fine. But come at them with the solution to the problem.
Yeah, okay, let's see, we're coming up on time, so get those questions in if you have any more. One question that we got was, it would be great to learn about opportunities to review grants. Yes, so again, this is a 5-part series, and we're actually going to have a very limited part, part 4 of the series, where you are going to be able to have the opportunity to send us in advance grants that you have written, and we will give you, we will read them in advance, and then we will give you our personalized one-on-one time to go over our feedback for you and answer any further questions that you have. So that's going to be very limited. So, if you have a grant that you really want to get, that you want to take a stab at, and have us look that over, just to let you know that that is going to be coming up. But the other ones will be totally open like this, and they will cover some more things like that. All right, well, I think it's, oh yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Hi, thank you, Kelsey and Cassandra, for this webinar. It was very informative, and you made it fun too. So thank you so much again. So it was more about for the next sessions. So when you were talking about the prep work, we're talking about gathering data and all, and I was wondering if you were going to do a little like special on like museums or other nonprofits who just start, like meaning that they don't have a physical place yet, and is it possible to do grants at that stage? Or
yeah, that's, I haven't thought of that because I have never worked for a museum that's new, but that's a really good thing that we could cover. I would say just one thing right off the bat is, if you're trying to start up a museum, check your local laws about fundraising. If you do not have a 501c3 and you start fundraising, you may be in for some legal trouble.
yeah, that's what I thought, yeah.
And I'll say this, that a lot of grants want to see your, how to word it, they want to see how you've handled your money in the past. So some of them will ask for your last 3 fiscal year budgets. They'll ask for your last year or two's audits. So basically they want to be able to see, how are you spending your money? Are you making sure that you're budgeting well? Are you making sure that you're stable every year? And so it's a little harder for a brand new museum or organization to kind of get these bigger type of grant funding, because they're going to want that information, which you're not going to have.
My gut feeling is to focus on corporate if you're trying to start up, because then also you can be like, oh, this is going to be the Chevrolet Museum of whatever, or like this wing, naming opportunities, something like that.
So right now we already have the status checked with the state, and so we were having the idea to actually just start just with an event, kind of like a prototype of what we're going to do inside the museum, and just invite people of the community, and then from those results, just using it as like a data. But again, that would be great to have experience from other people from the webinar in the next ones, of course, of like, what was their best timing to start really with like grants after year to year. Yeah, that would be great.
That's a really good question. Yeah, we want to get some guest speakers on our next one, so maybe we can find somebody who can speak to that sort of thing. I think that's a really good question, so we will take notes of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Great, thank you.
We are a little bit over time. I don't really mind if anybody else has any further questions, extending it a little bit. Let's see, oh, somebody just entered the one. I wonder if they accidentally got kicked off. Any last questions? Thank you so much to everybody who answered about if the scheduling for these. Sounds like monthly is going to work out for everybody. That's great.
Yes. Thank you so much, because that helps us plan.
Yeah, and again, we really appreciate everybody who came out tonight and talked grants with us. Glad if you found it of use so far, and hope that we'll see you at Grant Writing 201 next month. If in the meantime you have some sort of question that comes up or something that you would like to see on a future one, definitely drop us a line. You can either find us on Facebook, you'll see us in the EMP group quite a bit, or our emails are what are they? They're long. northeast@nationalempnetwork.org. And what is yours? Southeast at National EMP Network?
Southeast.
Yeah, nationalempnetwork.org. Yeah. And you can check that out for our website as well, where you can find the recording of this and other previous programs that we are doing. We also, grant writing is just the tip of these iceberg for these multi-part kind of courses that we want to be able to offer for people. We plan on doing professional development, perhaps collections care, so if you have other topics that you're dying to learn about that you don't find that there's a good affordable, not behind an expensive paywall resource out there, definitely let us know what you want to hear from National EMP. We're really here to support you and provide resources for EMPs going forward. So please be in touch with us, and we are excited to see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.